A home is a lot of work. Just plain work.
When work at home is planned and organized for cooperation, there can usually be more time for leisure.
I'm certainly in favor of those things. Leisure, fun.
Who isn't?
Wouldn't we all be happier if we worked out a little system for living together in harmony?
But how can we manage them?
We'll have to work out the full answer together.
Say, Mom, you're swell.
Most family problems can be solved through frank and friendly discussion, which points the way to a happy family life.
You know, this is beginning to be quite a family project.
It certainly is.
Well, I would just like to start by acknowledging that despite the fact Jeremy just told you we could all go home, there's really nothing else to look forward to in the service. I'm not offended. I do actually agree with him to a degree. I mean, I can't imagine a better picture of why we do what we do, or a setup that adds more weight to a series about family that speaks to the potential for pain in family and also the potential for hope and meaning and new scripts as well. And so what I'd like to do to start our time is something that I call a Jeff Brown transition. Jeff Brown was Jeremy and I's high school small group leader when we were here at Inside Out. And as high school guys would do a lot, we get off topic, 10 times a Sunday, and he'd have to reel us back in. And so his typical approach was something like, hey guys, speaking of your ex-girlfriends, what do you think about Easter? And it's like, okay. So he would do this constantly throughout the group. So what I'd like to do is, speaking of powerful stories of life change, how about the Olympics? Because that's how I was planning to start today. If you haven't been tracking the calendar, we at 2 o'clock today are going to get the closing ceremonies for the 2024 Olympics, which for me is a little bit bittersweet. Like, there's been this kind of fun, unifying thing where we all have something to cheer for together. But I also get really curious about myself, because I've been noticing again and again, I keep finding myself getting passionate about a sport that I didn't know existed 30 seconds ago. Does anybody else experience this? Like apparently we won a medal for the first time in 20 years in artistic swimming. And I'm like, yes, America, I'm just like excited for that. Or when I watch those speed walkers, I just do you know how secure you'd have to be to do that for the whole world to watch? As a grown, I'm just I can't, it's crazy. They're amazing, just enjoying all of these. And the U.S. has obviously had some really cool moments. It's crazy that both the men's and women's basketball teams had to play France in France for the gold medal. That's pretty wild. The women's soccer team yesterday, we were big underdogs. I think we were 5 in the world. Yeah, we can applaud for them, absolutely. So we just had a lot of really cool moments, big track moments yesterday. And the reason that I wanted to start out with that is actually very intentional. So right at the beginning of the Olympics, after the men's first basketball game, I was watching this conversation. It was between a radio talk show host, his name's Colin Coward, and our previous men's Olympic basketball coach. That's Coach K. He's a legendary coach, I think 42 years at Duke. And he was the head coach for our 2008, 12, and 16 gold medals in the Olympics. And so Colin is asking Coach K about this very specific player. He asked him about Jason Tatum. If you like basketball, you know who this is. If you don't, doesn't matter. I'll catch you up to speed. Jason Tatum just won the NBA Finals with the Boston Celtics in June. And he was being talked about in the moment like he's a top 10, maybe top 5 player in the world, one of the highest paid players in the world as well. And in game 1 of the Olympics, he didn't play. And so Colin was asking him, hey, is this a big deal? From the perspective of a coach who's been here, does this matter? Is this a big deal? Coach K said, absolutely not. Is the goal to get everybody a certain amount of minutes, or is the goal to win gold? Nobody should care how many minutes individual guys are getting, which preaches even better considering that we won the gold medal yesterday, right? But he was speaking to this dynamic of there is a team goal. And interestingly, Jason Tatum started a few more games in the Olympics, and there were a few more he didn't play at all because he had a very specific role based on a matchup and so on. What I would like to talk about today in part 5 now of this series is winning as a family unit. Not concerned about our own individual symbolic statistics and who's right and who's doing how much and scorekeeping and so on, but winning as a family team. I think Coach Kerr has a tough job on a team with 12 of the best players in the world who are the best on their own teams. They're used to playing all game long, to have to manage those egos and bench some of those guys and say, hey, we've got a goal. I want to talk about this, winning as a team, winning as a unit, because I'm not assuming that is all of our instinct, that's kind of the default that we all go to. Because I think a lot of times in our culture, it is marketed to us, and oftentimes from well-meaning family and friends, it's communicated to us that your happiness is the bottom line. Your happiness is the main goal. I mean, that's why we date, because somebody makes us happy. We get engaged, we get married because we think it'll increase our happiness. We have children because we think it'll make us happy. There is this unspoken or oftentimes very spoken goal that your happiness is on the line. We're allowed to make changes in our family because we're not happy anymore. And my suggestion in this series is if your happiness is how you measure the health of your family, if your happiness is the ultimate goal, in the long term, I think you will miss out on most of the happiness that our families really have to offer us. Certainly not the first person to come up with this kind of idea. I mean, think about Viktor Frankl in the 1940s wrote Man's Search for Meaning and said it is the very pursuit of happiness that thwarts happiness. In the context of our family units, if you have a conscious or a maybe subconscious belief, if the way you approach maybe the question you ask yourself is this question, what can this relationship do for me? Probably the relationship is not going to do much for you in the long run. Think about this just in terms of conflict, just in terms of like you're in an argument, you're fighting, you get defensive, you want to be right, you want to win the argument. Okay, that's an approach, you can try that, and think about it, when one person wins, the relationship loses. You're right, but then somebody you love, your spouse, your kids, your sibling, your parents loses. The relationship loses. So instead, we're talking much more kind of the age-old, metaphor of we're fighting for the team on the front of the jersey, not on the back of the jersey. Although it breaks down a little bit with family. Most of the people I'm fighting for have the last name Geist. It's the same thing. But you kind of get the point of what it is that I'm trying to say. What does it look like to win as a team, as a family unit? And I'd like to point us back to the first part of this series because I think it's very relevant to where we are today, which is to hold the real and the ideal in tension. That's all we talked about in part one. We said that there is ideals and that we can't change the ideals and we don't have to pretend like we are the ideal. Instead, let's be honest about the real. And that space in between is where hope is found, that things could get better. It's where real life happens. It's where God's grace meets us. It's where growth ultimately occurs. And so we said, let's live in that space throughout this series. And we've talked a lot about the real. I mean, we have each of the communicators, Buck, myself, Jeremy, we talked about the complexity in our own families. We look at the complexity in Jesus' family tree. We talked about managing when expectations let you down again and again and again. Jeremy last week gave a powerful message on forgiveness, both honored the practical element of it and also how long the process can be. I mean, we have spent a lot of time in the real. And talking about winning as a family, though, is idealistic. It is not possible in this sense for all of us. It certainly doesn't feel sustainable to do on a daily basis, and yet we're going to put it out there because it gives us hope of something to strive for. Specifically, we're going to look at a section or a passage in the New Testament that if you were to open up in your physical Bible, you would probably see a heading that looks something like this: instructions for households, or the household code maybe. And we felt like we couldn't do a series about family and not get to this really foundational passage that just gives a whole lot of clarity about the ideal in families. Now, this is a specific application to family units and family relationships, but it is actually an explanation of the new ethic that Jesus introduced that ultimately changed the world. We take it for granted because we're 2,000 years post-Jesus, but it changed the world, it changed the culture that Jesus stepped into. And we see it in Ephesians 21, we see Paul's wording of the ethic that has changed the world since, and that is submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. The ethic is what Jesus introduced when he said, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. He tied our example, he tied our definition of how to interact in our relationships, how to love people based on the way that he loved us, and that was brand new. This is the application now to households. And we might, to be fair, get hung up on the very first word, that word submit. And I actually think, I don't know that over time it's continuing to be as helpful of a translation. I think it once was a good translation. I think the way that we think about the word submit in our current context is a little bit more about like domination, is a little bit like power out of control, is a little bit like using my authority or my position to get what I want out of you, perhaps to abuse you, right? And that's not at all what the context of the passage really is speaking to. So based on your understanding of submit is going to give a lot of clarity to the passage. I mean, you could think about just some similes, similar words or phrases. You could think about to yield, which I think is much more helpful. You could think about to defer. Hey, I'm going to choose you. I'm going to choose your way in this moment. I'm going to defer to you. I'm going to empower another. That's what we're doing when we submit to one another. We're going to say, I'm going to leverage me for your benefit. Humble oneself. We would all say, man, that's a good thing to aspire to, cooperating with or agreeing to. It's following someone's leadership or abilities. It's letting go or releasing some of the weight that we're carrying. All of these speak to ways in which we leverage ourselves, our time, energy, resources, gifts, and talents for the needs and for the benefit of another. I really think the word that's helpful, and you're starting to see this in a lot more like newer translations, is the word yield. And again, it's not because the meaning of the passage has changed. It's just an English thing. It's helping us understand what that passage was speaking to. And yielding speaks to this power under control. For me, this is an interesting metaphor to use because in all of the areas of life where I need to submit or yield, I may actually be practically worse on the rows. Like that might be the most area I have to improve. For some reason, I see a yield sign, and to me, it's like a finish line on the road instead of a yield sign. It's like, I've got to work on that. I'm going to cut somebody off at Northpoint. It's not going to be good. And so, but you get the idea of this yielding to say, hey, I have the ability, I've got the horsepower maybe, right? I could step on the gas, and I could go in front of you. It's likely to increase some chaos. It's maybe going to stress you out. There's potential for actual physical destruction here, right? Or I could yield to you, which is different than stopping, which is different than disengaging, right? It's not participating, but it's saying, while I could, I'm going to do what's best for you in this moment. I think the visual that's helpful that we sometimes use to talk about this relational dynamic is this triangle right here. It's this idea that any two people fighting to be in relationship ultimately have an authority that is above any one of us individually. Now, there's a man and a woman represented here. The next couple of verses, you talk about husbands and wives, but this transcends that. This is a family series, just a relational dynamic. Picture could be parents, could be your children, could be siblings, could be extended family, any of those things. When we're speaking of the ideal, we have a North Star that we appeal to. It gives us direction. It gives us clarity. It gives us somewhere to go when we don't know where to go and we don't know how to resolve the tension. And it reminds us that we are on the same team going in the same direction. Think about the alternative to this, if you will. And you really have to think about this, especially if you're new to church, new to faith, you're trying to figure out what you believe. Think about what the alternative would be if you're like, I don't think, I'm not going to submit to God. I don't like that. I know it's best for me. Well, ultimately, whether you would say it this way or not, the only other way to operate is I'm my own authority. I always know what's going to be best for me in the long run. I always know what's going to make me happy. I would never look back with any regrets like I would have done anything different, right? I always have all the facts. And so it's this approach this way, which means you get in a relationship with somebody and it's the honeymoon stage. It's the initial moment that you meet that is the most exciting, but as time goes and you realize you're both humans with flaws and your own preferences and interests and wants and needs and desires, the only way you can go over time is a decision to make it's either my happiness or yours. This approach does not work in the long run, which is why if we go back to our triangle, we would say, for the sake of this section, Paul is speaking to this like it is the ideal, that we have our North Star, our authority that gives us the inspiration to, the strength to remain on the same team when we cannot. And the dynamic of how we would summarize this section that Paul's unpacking is mutual submission. In the ideal, and part of this is what's vulnerable. The ideal is that both sides of the relationship are making this commitment to say, I'm going to leverage me for you. That's what makes it vulnerable, because they may not. They may not interact and engage in the same way, and that's part of the risk-taking that you're taking here to enter into the relationship, to strengthen the relationship. But it's saying both sides are leveraging, I'm going to yield to you. I'm going to yield for your benefit. That doesn't mean that there aren't different distinctions and roles, right? I'm not suggesting that your children run your household, okay? He gets into the application of this and how it is that we now apply this for different stages of our life or roles that we may play in different seasons of our life. So if we go back to the foundational verse again, verse 21 that starts it all off, we've talked a little bit about submit here, this idea of to one another. It's both ways. But then it's reverence for Christ that unlocks everything that comes after this. Because I would say this ideal is really maybe not possible without a degree of the supernatural. Without the understanding of what it is that Jesus has first done for us and leaning into his grace and his strength and his example that he offers us every day. This is why we say it's him that we're pointing to. It's reverence, awe, adoration of him, because he's the one that exemplified this. It's what he's speaking to in John 15 at the Last Supper, which is the night before he's crucified, and he says to his friends, greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. They didn't know that in 24 hours he was going to take that to its literal end, and he was going to give up his life for their benefit, to die in our place for the sin, the punishment that we deserved. Paul even gives us further insight to this when he says, and when he did this, we were still sinners. He says, but God demonstrates his own love for us in this, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Which means when we're thinking about treating one another as Christ has treated us, it doesn't mean that they're handling their side of the equation perfectly. It doesn't mean that they are now Jesus reincarnated. It doesn't mean that they have cleaned up every area, that they're sorry for everything they've ever done. No, they're going to miss the mark, just like you're going to miss the mark. But the challenge is to keep leaning into and keep submitting to Christ as we lean into and yield to one another. Christ did this voluntarily. His example, this reverence for Christ is somebody who submitted voluntarily. God, not my will, but yours, motivated by love. He voluntarily submitted to the will of the Father to die in our place. And we see everywhere throughout the New Testament that the fuel for that, the motivation for that was love. So you could say that the understanding of this passage, that first word that starts it all off, submission, is yielding out of love. Yes, for love for one another, but ultimately a love and a respect for what Jesus did for us. And as we're in relationship with him and we know him more fully and intimately, it increases our love for one another as well. So when you see the triangle now, we understand it's as we draw nearer to God, we actually move nearer to one another along that path as well. And this makes really practical sense, right? If you just think about a few examples, as we draw near to God, as we become more confident in who it is that he created us to be, more secure in our identity, as just one example. Now all of a sudden we're able to admit we're sorry faster. We're able to apologize quicker. We're able to extend forgiveness quicker. We're able to sit and listen to the person on the other side of us without having to get defensive. We feel like we can be our real selves, our real honest, vulnerable, flawed selves. We don't have to pretend. We can take the masks off because we know who we are in Christ's image. And so, of course, two people that are both doing that, two people that are becoming more selfless, more secure in who they are, of course that relationship is going to be richer over time as we move towards one another, not away from one another, as we submit to what it is that Jesus has called us to. Now, what comes after this is the controversial. What comes after this feels complicated in our current cultural context, and I believe the majority of that is because these verses are taken out of context and not directly connected to 21. 21, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ, is the theme of the whole passage for households, and everything is an application of how each member of the family ultimately is able to apply that. So think about one of the most controversial, Ephesians 5:22, for example, which starts this way: wives. Now, I went to Bible school just for incredible insights like this one I'm about to share with you. Wives, do you know what that means? It's written to wives. That's what it means. And so, therefore, if you're not a wife, we really don't get to do anything with this, right? This is not like we get to hold it over somebody or shame it over somebody or try to control. No, this is written to wives, and wives, you do with it what you will. But look at what the passage says. Look what Paul says. He says, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. I want to give several bits of kind of context here before I talk about some of the application of this. One of the things that's really significant is we understand this is a translation from Greek to English, right? In Greek, this wouldn't be broken up in sentences in the same way. It's actually one full continuous thought. And that word submit, actually in that first verse, isn't there in the Greek because it's connected to 21. This is really fascinating. It's submit to one another out of reverence for Christ, and how it would read in the Greek is wives to your husbands as to the Lord. Same in that second verse. It would be now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives to their husbands in everything. The reason that matters is it emphasizes that both times the command to the submit is given, it's tied directly to the example of Jesus and then tied exactly to the representation or the example of the church. Those aren't ideas in a vacuum. They're not applications in a vacuum, right? It's directly connected to Jesus. Another piece of context that's important to know is the first century audience that would have written this would not have been shocked by this passage. There were 55 words written to wives, and most of the first century readers would have yawned at this part. They would have been, yeah, tell me more. The next part that comes is 170 words to husbands, and that would have paused everybody in their tracks, because this is a total redefining of the role of a husband, a total complete new challenge and a flipping upside down of the leadership paradigm to husbands. Then you have to consider that he very clearly says right there in the passage, he says, submit to your husband, not all men, right? Your husband, which in the ideal, again, we're talking about the ideal here for a moment, in the ideal, it's a man that you chose, to call best friend, that is somebody that you have promised before others, before family, before God, that you are committed to, that you will cherish and love and serve. It is that one person. This is not all men. Anything else is a gross misapplication of this verse. So it's talking about that one man, that one individual. And it ultimately, hopefully you see that as it's tied to 21. It is a discussion specifically of role or function in the family unit, not value, talent, or importance, or goodness, intelligence. You only have to be married 24 to 48 hours to know your wife's smarter than you, right? I mean, it's definitely like, it's not any of those things. It's talking about how does the family win as a team? How does the family win as a unit? And so what I would be comfortable with, and I know there's a lot of caveats and context right there, I would be comfortable all day long apologizing for the abuse of this passage. If this passage has ever been used to control, to shame or manipulate, to silence your voice or your opinion or your own giftings or leadership, if it has ever been used to justify abuse, I mean, it is beyond ridiculous when you look at the passage in its context, because the whole passage is about mutual love and respect in our reverence for Jesus and that flowing through us to others. So all day long, I'd be like, none of those examples should ever happen. But what I don't want to do is apologize for what Paul is saying. I don't want to say he's saying nothing or there's nothing of value here, because he is very clear. And I think that when we lean into what it is that he's suggesting, there is benefit for every dynamic of the family unit. There is benefit to wives, there is benefit, yes, to husbands, and there is benefit to the family winning as a whole. Just as an example, wives, do you know that your words hold a unique weight with your husbands? I know that is true specifically for me and Emily, and the reason I know that's true is because she knows me better than anybody else in the world. She sees me off stage, she sees me tired, she sees me defensive, prideful, reacting, she sees all of the ugly in me. And so when I get off stage and somebody says something kind, or I always appreciate it. I mean, I really do. It means a lot when people come up. There's an insecurity and a vulnerability, talking to a whole bunch of people like this. And when Emily says something, it's just different, because she's speaking to a different part of my heart and my soul that I've opened up to her. There's a way that she can encourage me and motivate me and make me feel alive in a way that just nobody else can. I think about some of the practical day-to-day. And she's out with some friends or something, and I'm taking care of Davis, our little guy, and I try to clean up the house a little bit while she's gone. I know she'll appreciate that. And the first thing she does is come in and walk in the door and be like, oh, wow, there's a lot of fingerprints on the fridge. It's just so deflating. It's like, man, I just spent the last hour. I tried my best. If she comes in and is like, oh my, you worked all day, you've been caring for him, and you clean the house, like you're I'm so grateful for you. I want to do it every day of the week, right? That's the secret. I'm just saying, like, it's amazing what that can do in fuel. And I'm not talking about codependence. I'm not saying she's responsible for all the reactions I have in that, but it is a unique relationship. There's a oneness there where I've opened my heart and soul to her, and she has the ability to speak life in just a unique way. And when we're fighting to be on the same team, This creates not just a peace and safety for you and in the relationship, but it creates a peace and safety for children as well, in a way that gifts or Disney can't, which I'm not saying those are bad at all, don't hear me say that. But the greatest thing we can do is create that peace, to fight for one another, to be on the same team, to notice when we're scorekeeping, when we're being passive aggressive, when we're assuming the worst, when we're just having conversations in our head, when we're being condescending, to notice all of that, versus when we're fighting to be on the same team. And then he moves to husbands, which when we see what he says to husbands, we might just wish he said submit to your wife, because he takes it a whole level more extreme. Because in the next verse, he says, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So while he calls a wife to yield to her husband's leadership, what he tells husbands is what you are to do with that leadership is die for her, is leverage you, your resources, your giftings, your ability to lean in, to engage, and prioritize her needs, her wants, her desires over your own. Is it an extreme standard that was brand new to this world and culture? He is tying this picture of leadership specifically to the image of the cross. He ties it to Jesus, and he just cuts right to the chase. In case you're wondering, what did Jesus do? Oh, he gave himself up for. He died for. That's our standard of leadership. Not getting just what we want, when we want, getting to boss people around for our benefit. It completely flips that paradigm upside down on its head. That we are called to engage, that we're called to protect her heart, that we're called to engage with our children, that we're called to work hard, to be a safe space, to listen, to lead, that all of that is a call to lean in the way that Jesus leaned in with us. And when both sides are committed to this, not getting this right every day of the week, but when both sides have a commitment to this over time, there is a picture that he paints as the end goal where he points all the way back to Genesis. And he says, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother, which is important, by the way, and be united to his wife. And the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery. And it's a fighting for that type of unity. And I'm passionate about a verse like this because the culture in which we live, marriage has come to a place where honestly for many it's just like an inconvenience. It's like what really changes from long-term dating. And I think part of the reason that's such a travesty is in the New Testament. In the ideal, which can be really hard to speak to in a room like this because I know so many times it has not gone the ideal. But this passage is really clear as well. I want to lean into it. In the ideal, that is a unique relationship amongst all other relationships. There is a oneness. That phrase, one flesh, is used only with husband and wife. Children are called same flesh. You gave birth to. They're not one flesh. It's not the same unity. There's an intimacy, a trust, a teamwork, a support, an encouragement that develops over time because you've made that commitment for life. It's not a dating relationship where you're waiting for the breakup. It's not a one-night stand where you wonder if they're going to be there in the morning. It is we are here through thick and thin, and you see the worst of me, but I can allow you to see the worst of me because you've promised not to go anywhere. And when that happens in the ideal, it is a force in the family unit. It is a source of safety for children, and it starts to change families, churches, and communities as God allows that family unit to do things that he has called it to do. You could say that marriage in the ideal is a submission competition. If you'll just play along, just imagine that it's like, hey, it's Friday night, you're trying to figure out what you are wanting to do, and he says, hey, I think we should go see that new chick flick. And on the way, maybe we could get a pedicure together and swing by Starbucks, you get an extra 14 shots of sugar in there or whatever you need. And she's like, no, I think we should go to your favorite sports bar, you should get that new beer that's on draft, and then we could also just watch the game tonight. I mean, your gender roles could be completely flipped. I know people that are, okay? That's not the point. I'm just saying, could you imagine that combo, the energy of that combo, versus, oh my gosh, once you've seen one chick flick, you've seen them all. There's some rich guy in the beginning who owns a hotel who's a jerk. By the end, they have babies. It's like, that's all of them. And she's like, well, have you watched a basketball game? In the hoop, timeout, in the hoop. I mean, that's all the same, That energy on the trite things or on the more serious things. Right, are two fundamentally different approaches to how we engage, to the grace that we extend, to the way we're fighting to be on the same team with one another. He moves then and he gives an application to children, which is why I'm saying there's different roles and functions. This isn't like children run your household, but he goes specifically to children. He says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. And now you've seen the first verse that you want your children to memorize, right? Like, this is a good one. And again, this is speaking in principle. In 98%, I don't know what the math would be, in most situations, it's going to be best for the family unit if the children follow parents that are doing the best that they can. Are there some extreme examples? Are there situations where abuse? Sure, of course there are the extremes. But in talking about the principal element, we're fighting to be a team. And then it goes to parenting. He actually specifically leans right in with fathers, and he says, fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord, which is so significant because he says specifically, speaking to fathers, that your words have a unique weight. Fair or unfair, right? Moms, this kind of works for and against you. What this is saying is it's just a degree easier for kids to believe your unconditional love for them. But dads, when you lean in and say, I love you, when you say I'm proud of you, when you say to her, you're beautiful, it holds a different weight. And when you shame, and you overreact, and you guilt trip, you say those words you wish you could take back, those hold a different weight as well. For some of us, our stories are still impacted today by what dad did or did not say. That baptism story we just watched is a powerful example of both ends of the extreme of that spectrum. So we're called to lean in. One of the mentors of my life, he talked about specifically this kind of concept with me as I was about to become a parent. And he said, it's interesting that in generality, so this is not all people, sometimes it's switched, but in generalities, mom has a unique gift to meet the child where they're at, to attune to them in the moment, to love them as they are. Dad often spends more time thinking about who they will be or could be in the future. And I was thinking about just that last week. We got a 6-month-old, and he was whining all day long. Not crying, it was meh, 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 14,000 times in a row. I beat the record of 13,000 the day before. And I looked at Emily and I was like, I think he's trying to manipulate me. I think he knows that if he does this long enough, I'm going to do, and I'm not okay with that. And she's like, well, could be, or it could be that he's a baby. And he's just discovering he has 2 hands and not just one. And I'm like, fair enough, he's not 30, right? There's something just in us, but wherever you land on that kind of, the spectrum or whatever your disposition is, it's important to know that in the moment, your words matter. And when you get it wrong, this is what's great as well. My wife is a counselor, and she said, you can get it wrong up to 1/3 of the time. There's literally science on this. You get it wrong 1/3 of the time, but when you get it wrong, the important piece is to repair. And when you repair, as an adult, when you say, I'm sorry, to your child, you model that for them. You are sacrificing that moment. You are humbling yourself in that moment. It can do a world for the relationship as well. Bottom line, big idea or concept of part 5 today is to win as a family, yield out of love. I'm here to leverage me for your benefit so that not I win, not you win, but so that the team wins. I want to give 2 very simple applications. If you're like, what do I do with all the theoretical? Do very simple applications that go in both directions of the triangle, and then we'll be done with our time. The first is very simply a question. The question is this: how can I help? And just to make sure you know how to use the tool, I want you to hear yourself say it out loud on the count of 3, okay? 1, 2, 3. How can I help? What this does is this creates movement across the bottom of that period. This is the bridge of mutual submission because it summarizes the entire part 5 today in 4 words. It says, I see you. I know you have value. I know you're carrying a weight. I know what you're doing is important. It matters to me. I'm here to benefit you. I'm here to help. Now, I recognize some of us are in family dynamics and relationships where our triangle looks a little bit more like this dynamic or situation. And I would say even in that caveat, the application is still the same. Because when you engage in this same way, it still has the potential over time to influence. It's not a promise, it's not a guarantee, and it's not your responsibility. But there is a potential that this kind of influence can happen over time. And we know that because there are several passages that are just so clear on this. Peter says this, and 1 Peter says it a couple different ways. He says in the same way, wives should yield to your husbands. Then if some husbands do not obey God's teaching, they will be persuaded to believe without anyone saying a word to them. They will be persuaded by the way their wives live. Then he pulls out and he just goes to all people. The chapter before, he says, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. That somehow the way in which you engage and value and treat people, it adds weight and believability and authority to what it is that you say you believe. So when we look at our triangle of how can I help across the bottom, this is so practical. You can try this this afternoon in the car ride home. And I would say it's not quite enough in the long term. It's simple. You can try it out. But there also has to be something that communicates not just I'm here for you across, but that communicates I'm yielding to you, I'm submitting to you northward as well. And for that, I would suggest this very simple application. Pray together, out loud, on a regular basis. If you're married, maybe that's a daily. If it's your kids, maybe daily. There's all kinds of other family and sibling and parents, that might not be the regular rhythm. But what this does is it completes the triangle. There's a question to say, hey, I'm here for you, how can I help? And there's a question, or not a question, but there's a communication that's taking place to say, God, I submit to you. Not my will, but your will. God, I yield to you. And when you do that together, it has the ability to remind you of the fact that you're on the same team, that you have your North Star and directive. In the specific context of marriage, there's actually been a lot of research on this. It's really wild. I mean, you've heard before the average divorce rate is 1 in 2, somewhere in that range in America. There's a study done in Phoenix that said the divorce rate among couples who pray together on a daily basis is 1 in 1,156, which even if it's off by a factor of 10, is compelling to at least consider. So, especially if you've never done this before, here's just a couple tips for you to try, because praying out loud can be awkward. There can be an anxiety with it. There can be like, I don't know, and I've never done that. There's a weird vulnerability to it. One tip might be to say, short and awkward, but consistent is better than long, flawless, and inconsistent. Don't put too much pressure on this. I mean, if tonight you just reach over and you grab her hand and you're like, God, I'm praying out loud, like the kid told me to. Amen. Right? You've got a rep, right? Like, we tried it. There's tomorrow, you can keep going, right? Buck, not that long ago, we did a whole series on prayer. It actually went through the Lord's Prayer, so practical and helpful. We have that linked in our What's Next page. You can go and watch it if you're like, I don't even know where to start. That could be a place for you. I think also I would just try to keep in mind, pray with each other, not at each other, right? This is not God. Please put a burden on Jim's heart that the trash is meant to stay in the trash can. Let him know I forgive him for what he said to my mom. Please remind him that our anniversary is coming before I have to. Amen, right? I mean, it's just, if that's the tone, that's not the goal, the exercise, right? We're praying with one another. But as we do that, as awkward as it may be, if you've never done it before, the stats are really low on Christians that do this together. So if you're like, man, I'm going to try this, this is an opportunity for you to try that. But it completes the triangle, right? It completes there's something in each direction. So let me just ask you as we close our time, where do you need to yield out of love? Are you scorekeeping? Are you being passive-aggressive in your communication? Are you expecting them to read your mind? Have you been in control for so long? Has it been your way or the highway for so long? Have you listened in a while? When was the last time you complimented or encouraged them? Is it mean yielding to your own just passivity or pride and engaging as that's what's required of you? You've probably got an area, you've probably got a relationship. Just start. This afternoon, take a step in that direction. This bottom line of part 5 today, to win as a family, yield out of love. Not for my happiness individually, but what you may discover in the long run is a happiness and a richness you couldn't have experienced otherwise. Would you pray with me? Father, we're doing it. We're talking out loud. We're praying out loud. We know that you're here with us. God, you've designed this because you love us, because you are love. God, you've designed relationships. You've designed family. For some of us, that's heavy and hard to say because of what we've experienced with family. For others, we experience gratitude because of that. But we just ask that you meet us in it, that you give us the humility, God, to ultimately yield our will, our ability, our thoughts, our giftings for the benefit of those we care about, for the benefit of others. God, ultimately, you are authority, and we're trying to love people the same way that you have first loved us. God, would you guide us and show us what that next step is? And we pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you guys for hanging or tuning in. We will be finishing up this series next Sunday.